Hey, I'm Alex Macklin from Board Game Co, and here are 8 games I recommend you try out if you like Pandemic. This is an ongoing series I do on the channel where I pick a game, usually a well-known game, and then pick a variety of other games that I think are worth you trying out or looking into, seeing if they're for you, if you like that other game. Obviously, the reverse is true. If you find one of these games list you already know and you haven't played the actual title or Pandemic over here, you can go in any direction on this video. Take it as you will. It's generally just a series of recommendations around mechanics, themes, things that I think will pull you in. And to that end, let's briefly talk about Pandemic in case you don't know what it is, tell you what the game is, how it works, and then talk about my recommendations, some of which are on the table, others of which aren't. Pandemic is an action selection game. It's a cooperative action selection game, which means it's you against the board. You and the other players are operating against a board that is slowly trying to kill you. The way the game does that is the game starts off with a variety of diseases populated on the board, and you're using your actions to move, to travel, to fly. You're going to be trying to cure diseases. Every turn you're going to be drawing cards, and those cards can be utilized. If you have 5 cards of the same color, you can go to a research station, which you can go ahead and then cure that disease. Once you've cured all 4 diseases, you win the game. But after you've taken your turn and done your actions, the game is going to effectively fight back, be populating the board with more and more diseases, and the way the game operates with a central mechanism that defines, similar to the way an actual pandemic would work, the areas that have been hit the hardest generally keep on being hit. So you might get a flare-up over here or a flare-up over there, but you generally know that there's a region that's being hit with a lot of disease, it's going to continuously be hit, and you have to act and react accordingly. It's a game that uses strategy, a degree of luck, and working together with an action selection mechanism to ultimately save the world from being, exterminated by diseases. It was also a game, fun random fact over here, it was a game that was a lot more theoretical and a lot less practical before COVID-19, and then suddenly people were like, hey, turns out pandemics aren't a thing of the past, this is an actually relevant game. Sales of Pandemic completely went through the roof after COVID because it was a lot more relevant in a scary kind of way. But anyways, today we're going to be going over 8 game recommendations if you like Pandemic, and 2 of them are almost cheating. Because the first one is going to be Pandemic Iberia. What you may or may not know, depending on your involvement in the board game space, is Pandemic is not just a game, but Pandemic has spawned an offshoot line of so many different games. There's the Hot Zone line of games, there's a Cthulhu Pandemic, there's a Star Wars Pandemic, there's so many different Pandemic systems that are built on the core infrastructure of what makes Pandemic work, and you can look into any of those. If the idea of Star Wars, Cthulhu, I don't even know what they have, World of Warcraft, if any particular themes seem to appeal to you, that might be a good place to start. But the highest rated Pandemic, at least I believe the highest rated Pandemic, is Pandemic Iberia. It takes place a little bit more in the past. You can be traveling by carriage, by rail, you can be moving around the board, curing diseases. It takes the main core mechanics that make Pandemic work, but it is the highest rated, the most well-received Pandemic. So if you like the Pandemic system, and you want to see the one that generally is recommended as the best version in that system, highest rated with a caveat. It's the highest rated standalone Pandemic that isn't a legacy game, and that's going to be one that it's worth checking out. If you like Pandemic in general, it's worth trying out one of the higher rated standalone versions of that game. There's also, by the way, expansions to Pandemic. If you haven't tried those, there's Outbreak, there's the lab in the lab. There's a whole bunch of other expansions as well to build on the Pandemic system as well. My second recommendation is going to be the actually highest rated Pandemic, which is Pandemic Legacy. Now over here I have Season 0. This isn't the highest rated one, but Season 1 is going to be the highest rated Pandemic system at all. Pandemic Legacy builds off the core structure of Pandemic, but it turns it into a legacy game. A legacy game is a game that builds and evolves as you play it. Now the downside of that is effectively you are permanently altering the board as you play through this game. And again, there's Seasons 1, 2, and then 0, which goes back in the past. 1 is generally considered to be the best, then 2, then 0, I believe is the order of how well they're received. It's also my personal order of how much I like them, but I like all of them. But a legacy game involves destroying and changing and altering the game as you play, which means in Pandemic Legacy, and again, they'll vary depending on which one you're playing, but if you take the basic Season 1, as things happen in the game, you're putting stickers on the board, you're altering your characters, you're unlocking abilities, and those things will carry over from game to game. So when you finish your game and you have or haven't saved the world, there's an ongoing story. When you return to the game, either right away on your next session or maybe a week later or a month later, there's now something that's built in place, a permanent impact to how your first session went. And that legacy will carry over between 12 to 24 games is how long Pandemic Legacy lasts, 12 to 24. If you do the best possible ever, you'd only need 12 games. Your worst possible version of losing as much as you possibly can would be 24 games. Generally, I'd say you can expect to be seeing around 16 to 20 games, depending on how well you do, but you're going to be permanently altering, adjusting, and carrying over that legacy as you continue to play. It makes for one of the best experiences I've ever had playing a game, to the point that I've played Pandemic Legacy Season 1 twice, Pandemic Legacy Season 2 twice, and Season 0, I need to actually play this one twice, I haven't done that yet. But in general, the downside of it, the flip side, is the fact that you are paying for a game that is permanently altered, which means once you're done with those 16 to 20 or so games, generally in that range, you are looking at a game that theoretically can continue to be played in its final state, but I would say most people don't. Most people do not continue to play the Pandemic Legacy. At that point, going to basic Pandemic or Pandemic Iberia or any of those offshoots usually will be a better choice for you at that point, but you do have the theoretical possibility, but that's up to you. On the other hand, you are paying somewhere in the range of $50 to $60 if you play it as a 4-player experience. That works out to like around $15 per person. That's $1 per game per person. It is a reasonable price point for the sheer amount of enjoyment you will get out of playing through a legacy game. From there we have Flashpoint Fire Rescue. One of the first games I ever played that I mentally thought was similar to Pandemic. I had played Pandemic first, it was one of the first games I've ever played, and Flashpoint Fire Rescue came along a little bit later, and I was like, oh, this feels very similar. The difference is in Pandemic you are saving the world from disaster. In Flashpoint Fire Rescue, the same general mechanics are happening, but you're saving a house from burning down and the people inside it. In Flashpoint Fire Rescue, you're still operating with that action point selection, the idea that you have a limited number of action points, and you're trying to utilize those action points to basically solve everything. To move around the board, to fight fire, to turn fire into smoke, to extinguish smoke entirely, to go ahead and pick up survivors and try to pull them back to the ambulance to rescue them. You are operating to break down walls with your axes, to open doors. All the things you need to do are present as far as your general actions you're trying to take, but at the end of every turn, you're rolling dice and then fire is spreading. Now, a big difference between Flashpoint and Pandemic is going to be, aside from the general theme differences, the general sense of survival and the game fighting against you, that's all present. But I would say Pandemic operates with a degree of almost planning, similar to the way an actual Pandemic would work. The areas that have been affected continue to be affected more heavily. In Flashpoint Fire Rescue, it's a bit more random and chaotic. For better or for worse, the experience you're looking for might alter. You might be more pulled in by the theme, you might be more pulled in by the mechanisms, but I'd say that the fire spreading is a random mechanic that could hit anywhere. You can't plan around it. You have to be ready to adapt to whatever happens, and whenever an area that's on fire gets hit or they continues to hit an explosion, you're going to have triggered explosions that blow apart walls, hit your firefighters, and you have to react and adapt to what's happening, trying to not lose as many survivors as you can afford to not lose while you try to win the game. So different system, very similar theme, some similar mechanisms, but also being very different at the same time, and very expandable. They have a lot of Flashpoint games and expansions. They don't have a line of games, but they have the base game, they have a lot of expansions, and they even recently came out with a legacy version of Flashpoint as well, if you do find yourself getting into legacy games and seeing their charm. From there, we have Horrified. Now, Horrified has, I believe, 3 versions by now. There's the original Horrified, there's Greek monsters. No, there's 4 versions. There's American monsters, there's like world monsters. I think we're on the 4th version of Horrified. I don't think the 4th one is out yet, but coming out. But we have Greek monsters over here. And Horrified, again, similar general idea. In this game, similar general idea with a big difference. In Horrified, you're basically fighting against monsters. Depending on how many monsters you want to take on, that's going to be a difficulty level, because however many monsters you want to put on the board, just put them on the board. The problem is they're all acting and they're all getting in your way, and they all operate with their own unique way of how they operate, what they do, how to take them out, how to deal with them, because you are trying to engage or deal with these monsters. But you're moving around the board, you're collecting tokens, you're using your cards, and you're trying to be mindful of the fact that these monsters all operate differently, and the combination of monsters represent different puzzles you have to solve. Whether it's the locations you're going to, whether it's tokens you're collecting, whatever it is you're trying to do to take out these monsters, it's going to be the combination of monsters that keep the game alive. But again, you're operating with your characters, you're moving around your board, similar to Flashpoint, similar to Pandemic. You're still playing within a cooperative system where it's you against the board, where you operate, the board operates. In this case, the board are the monsters. So they're, as opposed to Flashpoint or Pandemic, where the things you're fighting against feel a bit more abstract. It feels like the elements of nature that you're trying to just desperately survive as long as possible against. In Horrified, one of the big differences is you're actually engaging with taking something down. This is not an abstract sense of nature versus you. This is something you can kill, or depending on how peaceful you thematically want to be, conquer, put to sleep, set aside, whatever it is you want to do. It depends on how fond you are of things like Bigfoot and all the like. But Horrified, again, comes with 4 versions at this point. I think the last one is not yet available, but for 3 versions you can get a 4th version that will be available at some point, and it's a system that I'm sure they're going to continue to expand because it has been very well received, which is why we're up to 4 versions so far. From there, we're going to take a drastically different spin, not in theme, but in mechanics. Because my next recommendation is Plague Inc. Now, Plague Inc. is going to be the first not cooperative thing that I'm recommending. In fact, it's the only non-cooperative game I'm recommending on this list. But the reason for Plague Inc. is because Plague Inc. is almost the reverse Pandemic. If you're kind of sick of saving the world from diseases, well, first of all, if you're kind of sick of Pandemic, maybe this isn't the right video for you. But if you've played through the concept of saving the world enough and you want to experience things from the other side, Plague Inc. is a board game version of the popular app where you are trying to exterminate exterminate the world as fast as possible. You're trying to make sure the disease is as deadly as possible. It has as much spreadability as possible. Instead of trying to make sure that you can slowly but surely exterminate the various ways the disease is spreading and eventually cure the disease, you're trying to find the virus that will kill as many people as fast as possible as you play through Plague Inc. From a mechanical perspective, this is not at all similar to Pandemic. It's the only game that has basically no similarities mechanically speaking, because you are not playing a cooperative game. You're not trying to use your action selection to slowly try to exterminate cubes. You're trying to basically destroy everything. But if you are interested in the theme of Pandemic and you want to see things from the reverse side, Plague Inc. is an interesting recommendation just to give you that sense of experience along the way. From there we have Ghost Stories, which is going to be possibly the most brutal cooperative game on this list. And I am taking this in terms of, I would say, complexity, although maybe Ghost Stories should be next on the list. But either way, Ghost Stories is going to be another cooperative experience where you're fighting against a horde of overwhelming ghosts. You're sitting in an eternal village, you're managing your various characters, you're trying to fight back against these ghosts that are slowly evading, slowly approaching the village as fast as possible, and the game is punishing. You're using the various actions of the various spaces within the village while trying to fight the ghosts, and it constantly feels like you're playing a step behind as you go through it. Similar to Horrified, you are at least fighting something you can theoretically beat until you eventually get to the big bad ghost monster you have to take down. Until then, you're playing a survival game of just trying to stay alive as long as you can. The game has had its own offshoot with a more medieval theme that I can't remember the name offhand. There's a more medieval offshoot theme of the game. But Ghost Stories has been incredibly popular, has expansions as well, but it's known particularly for the difficulty of the game. If you want something that's going to really punish you, that's going to force you to stay on your toes the entire time in a desperate effort to survive against a rampaging onslaught of ghosts, but with a very cartoon and approachable theme to it. Like, the game looks beautiful on the table. It doesn't look scary. It looks charming, appealing. It has an element of wanting to table the game and wanting to fight against it until you realize how challenging it is. But if you're looking for the extra bite to the difficulty, I'd recommend checking out Ghost Stories. Just walk into it knowing that it is known to be a hard game to beat. From there we have arguably my favorite game on this list. Arguably, although the last two are very, very close as far as my favorites over here. But we have The Loop. The Loop over here is one of my favorite cooperative games, and for me personally, it's the game that I consider to be my replacement Pandemic. It has that same general concept. You're trying to do good things, the game is trying to do bad things. In this case, you're trying to solve missions. You're going to be operating on a center board over here where there's a little bit of a round board, you're wandering around. The theme is that you're traveling back in time. I don't know if I strongly get that sense of it, but you manage and jump to various areas, you move from location to location. Meanwhile, there's cubes dropping out of a tower that you have to go ahead and deal with before places become overwhelmed. So you're trying to accomplish your missions, you're trying to avoid the spots becoming overwhelmed by these cubes, but using this principle of the loop. You're using energy to trigger your time travel so you can repeat your cards that you have in front of you every single round, because the more often you trigger your loop, the more you can re-trigger your cards, but the loop gets increasingly expensive every single turn, so finding the right time to be able to take advantage of the loop, to be able to have a set of cards that will benefit the most from looping, is a big part of the game experience. I find the game is highly variable, has a lot of scenarios that really make the game feel different every single time. Some of the way you can combine monsters and Horrified to give you a different feeling, the loop just has different scenarios. There's a bunch of expansions for the game as well. I have them all. They all give you just more scenarios, more ways to approach the game as you desperately struggle to try to persevere past the overwhelming onslaught of things happening. The game has difficulty modulation as well, so if you find yourself, you start the basic game, once you think you've gotten a handle on it, you can start ramping things up. But if Ghost Stories, if the idea of a challenging game from the get-go sounds too much, the loop is going to start off accessible, but you can certainly ramp it up as you're getting better to be able to match how good you are at the game. I find it to be incredibly satisfying. The deck of cards means it always feels like you're playing with a different set of powers and abilities. The asymmetric characters give you different sets of powers and abilities. Everything about the game gives me a Pandemic style feel of me against the machine, me against the game, while navigating a high degree of asymmetry from the characters, from the expansions, from the scenarios you have. All of that's going to drastically mix up the experience. The loop is going to be one of my top recommendations in this field if you're looking for a game that gives you that Pandemic feeling, but for me personally, better. And then lastly, we have Spirit Island. Spirit Island is going to be one of the most complicated games on this list to play. Not necessarily the hardest. I find one of the things that Spirit Island does really well, actually, is it gives you that sense of challenge the entire time. When I play through Spirit Island, I always feel like I'm really struggling to stay one step ahead of the enemy being the board in this case. But one of the things I like about Spirit Island is even though that feeling of challenge is there the entire time, so I feel like I'm mentally calculating all the odds and trying to play the right cards and use the spirits powers, even as I feel that the entire time, I find the game itself doesn't actually start off as being difficult. There's ways to ramp things up, make no mistake. You can ramp up a ton of little levers on the game that give different degrees of difficulty scaling so that you are in fact playing a punishing experience. But I find the basic intro version of Spirit Island feels difficult, and yet isn't if you're taking a strong analytical approach to the game. The basic idea is you have an island. You are playing as the spirits. You're helping the Dahan. The Dahan are going to be the natives of the island. Meanwhile, people are invading the island, building buildings, trying to come in, the conquistadors, and you're fighting back. You're using these spirits' powers. You can take control of a spirit if you're playing with multiple players. You each have a spirit, or if you're playing it solo, you can control multiple spirits if you want. But each spirit has a starting deck that you're going to build upon as you slowly put out your sanctuaries, but expand your presence on the board. Try to set yourself up so you can take out as many of these rampaging invaders as possible. The goal of the game is to either exterminate all the invaders at various levels of how high you have to do so, or to just escalate the fear so that they are too afraid, and eventually you just, through sheer terror, you get past them, you push them away from the island. Meanwhile, you're navigating with spirits that are going to have high defense, high manipulative, high operational manipulative, high control, high defense, high control, high attack, or high fear, using a combination of spirits that will hopefully all work together as you use their intrinsic board powers, their starting hand, and the deck that you've involved, and trying to combine an absolute ton of powers and abilities, all while you desperately try to stay one step ahead. And again, it feels like you're desperately trying to stay a step ahead, but usually in the basic game, you can persevere past them. The reality is the invaders feel like they're taking over, but they don't actually do anything that's that dastardly, as long as you're trying to approach it, well, analytically, trying to use everything at your disposal against them. The game has a bunch of expansions as well that will mix up the experience more and more for you. Expansions where I've dove into some of them, I have not yet gone into others, but it's one of the best games in my collection. I'd have a hard time picking whether I prefer Spirit Island or The Loop. And that's what you have over here. 8 game recommendations if you like Pandemic. These are all phenomenal games. Well, Plague Inc. I haven't played in so long that honestly I don't remember. Plague Inc.'s been a while. But these are all very strong. These are mostly very strong games, plus one that's been a while since I played. I remember enjoying it, but it's not currently in my collection. But either way, if you like Pandemic, here are 8 more games for you to try out. Let me know in the comments down below what you'd recommend as well. If you've played Pandemic, if you want to give recommendations to others watching this video, go ahead and post in the comments what other things you found have become a game that's either similar to Pandemic, replaced Pandemic, something in that general vein for you. In any case, and until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. I hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, I hope you have a good one.